Well, Andy, thank you very much for that introduction, and hello everyone, and welcome to the evening's fun and games. I'm here to talk about well, TIVA being better than inhalational anesthesia. Now, from the start, I just want to say that I'm not really a TIVA expert. I've only really been using TIVA for the last couple of years, and some of the talk that I'll be giving this evening will be about my journey from being an inhalational user to being a TIVA user. But as Andy said, I'm basically just a jobbing anaesthetist, and what I try and do in my day job at work is roughly what I try and do at home as well. I'm trying to do the best that I can for the planet at the moment, and this is a horribly complex slide here, but it's basically, I'm trying to, these things that I do at home. I'm buying less, I'm flying less, I'm trying to, I'm using less heat, so I'm, installing, sort of turning down the thermostat, that type of thing, becoming a vegan, becoming a sort of, eating less meat and everything. All of these things that I'm trying to do to reduce my carbon footprint at home. I go into work, and it's just, it's horrendous. The contribution of anesthesia to global warming. I mean, we're talking large amounts of environmental impact that we have in our practice every day. Now, although I'm just a jobbing anaesthetist, I do have a background interest, as I'm sure a lot of you do out there, in the environmental impact of our practice. And I got into all of that basically via the whole waste thing. It's horrendous going into work and seeing how many yellow bags we're filling each day with potentially recyclable waste. And myself and a chap called Dave Hutchins, who I don't know whether he's online tonight, but I hope he is. We went through all the rubbish back in 2009 and looked at sort of rubbish that we were producing. And we're producing, a lot of anaesthetic waste per theatre per year, about 2.5 tons of anaesthetic waste per year, and most of it was recyclable. And the sharp spoons were being used inappropriately, and we came up with this 5R approach to dealing with waste, which was mainly to take responsibility of it, to reduce the amount of waste that we produce in the first place, more so than to reuse it or to recycle it, and to do some research. So that's mainly my focus, was mainly to do with waste. In terms of actually thinking about the choice of anaesthesia, well, I had a bit of a head in the sand approach, as I think a lot of us do. I mean, a lot of us think, well, we've got to give an anaesthetic somehow. Does it really matter whether we give TIVA? Does it really matter whether we give an inhalational anaesthetic? Let's just give an anaesthetic. So although I was thinking about waste, I wasn't really thinking much about the choice of anaesthesia, and I hadn't really done so since I became a consultant, since I started doing anaesthesia in 1996. At the time we were taught that very much the way to give an anaesthetic was to give an intravenous induction, big syringe, little syringe, and then to maintain the anaesthesia inhalationally. And I'm still old enough that I can remember using halothane in the UK. I appreciate it's still used around the world. I've used enflurane mainly throughout my career. I've used isoflurane and a little bit of sevoflurane as well. Though that, at the start of my career, that was locked away as well. Yes, and we did use quite a bit of nitrous oxide to start off with, but I'm proud to say that I've never used desflurane, seeing as that's the most polluting of all the inhalational agents. Now, from 1996 to about 2009, that was basically how I gave general anesthesia. I used intravenous induction, isoflurane maintenance. 2009, I produced the stuff about the BMJ, about the waste in the BMJ, and then there was and then I sort of got into that. That's when I really got into green anesthesia as such. And it wasn't long before 2010, a very seminal paper that I should imagine many of you out there have already read, by Saulbeck Anderson, came out in the British Journal of Anesthesia, accompanied by an editorial by Shine. And then that was basically a paper about the environmental impact of inhalational anesthetic agents, about the fact that these were greenhouse, these were hydrofluorocarbons, these were greenhouse gases, and they were potentially causing a lot of damage to the atmosphere. And it quantified the amount of damage caused by desflurane and by sevoflurane and by isoflurane. And that was a very striking paper. So you would have thought after reading that and taking that one on board that, you know, that would have changed my practice. And it did. It did change my practice a little bit. It stopped me from using nitrous oxide. And, you know, I never really got turned on to using desflurane in the first place. And that paper certainly reiterated the fact that desflurane was never going to be something that I used. So did I do anything else? Well, no, I kept my head in the sand. And I think, you know, the reason for going through why I'm telling you this is because I think this illustrates what a lot of us do with our practice, you know, that we make small steps and we try and improve what we do, but it actually takes some time to move from using just inhalational anesthesia to using something slightly more high tech, maybe like TIVA. Now, I had my head in the sand, despite the fact that I was basically I wrote for the Association of Anaesthetists website, you know, basically their sort of green anesthesia information thing. So even someone like myself who was interested and was enthused about green anesthesia, even at that point, I was still basically using big syringe, little syringe inhalational maintenance. But then in 2012, Jody Sherman, who's going to be speaking later on, produced a paper in Anesthesia and Analgesia, basically comparing the environmental impact of inhalational anesthetics and propofol. And again, we'll come back to that paper later on, but that was really quite a seminal paper. And if you haven't read it already, I'd encourage you to seek it out. What did I do after that? Well, it made another small step change in my practice. I started using a lot more low flow anesthesia. And by low flow, I don't just mean, you know, cutting down to 2 or 3 liters per minute of fresh gas flow, but cutting right down to sort of 500 mils a minute or so or below. But again, it was another couple of years before I did anything else. And in 2015, there was this paper that came out. Now, Geophysical Research Letters is not a journal that I read religiously, but it's a paper by this chap called Vollmer, and it kept coming up in all of the green anesthesia papers that I was following and that I was reading at the time. And what that paper basically pointed out was not only is there there are measurable amounts of inhalational anesthetic agent in the atmosphere, but their amounts are increasing, and actually these things hang around for quite some time. So what did I do as a result of that? Well, again, I made a small change. I cut down on my use of isoflurane. In fact, I basically stopped using isoflurane and just started using sevoflurane only, because that's the least environmentally damaging of the inhalational agents. And I was using sevoflurane only at low flows. But it wasn't really until for another couple of years, 2017, 2018, that I really made the big change to TIVA, and I stopped using inhalational anesthetics completely, because the evidence was such that, you know, that TIVA was probably a better choice. And that was Mike Charlesworth's paper with Frank Swinton in the Lancet Planetary Health that basically, you know, just fully crystallized the fact that, you know, inhalationals at reasonable at the flows that most people use them without scavenging are leaking into the atmosphere and are causing measurable damage to the atmosphere. At the same time, the IPCC 1.5 degrees centigrade report came out. This was the one that said that we've got to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade if we want to, you know, if runaway environmental change isn't going to happen. And it was at that point I really decided, right, that's it. You know, that's enough. I'm not using inhalational agents anymore. I'm going to move to using TIVA. But that's a long time, isn't it? So that's basically 22 years it took me to get there. And this is 22 years that we don't really have. Now, in my defense, at the same time, I was also using a lot more regional anesthesia. So although, you know, if I did use general anesthesia, then I'd move to TIVA. Actually, I was using very little general anesthesia by this point, because I'm essentially an orthopedic anaesthetist, and so I was, you know, you can get away in orthopedics with using a lot of regional anesthesia with small amounts of intravenous sedation if you need to. But 22 years, it's a long time. It's a long time. Now, when we're faced with an existential crisis, a bit like global warming or COVID or something like that, then basically people fall into three categories. There's a small number of people who deny that global warming's happening. There's a small number of people who take decisive action, but most of us are in the middle. We're the inactive ones, we're the apathetic ones, and that's basically me in that 22-year period. Yes, I knew that I needed to change, but I didn't actually take a huge amount of action. And there's many commentators have pointed out recently, denial is pretty much the same as inaction. It's killing or letting die. You either deliberately kill the planet by denying the fact that global warming is going on, or you just don't do anything, and the outcome's the same, that you're still damaging the planet. And so it's only really action that's going to change. If we want to change the anesthetic, the environmental impact of our anesthetic practice, then we have to act. And the time to act is now. And certainly the reports from the IPCC that have come out recently, the environmental damage is not a long time in the distance now. Environmental change is here. It's happening at the moment. We've got to do something about it. And I'm often asked, on occasions that I am asked, what is the one thing that we can do? It's not a question of TIVA versus inhalational. It's not a question of single use versus reusables. It's actually committing to doing something in the first place. And that's probably the most important takeaway message from this talk today, that you've got to commit to changing your practice so that you minimize your environmental impact. And you're intelligent people. We're all intelligent people. If we educate ourselves, then we will find a way to reduce our own personal global impact. So how do you get informed? Well, what I've been basically working on with Cliff and Jody and Tom over the last year or so is these guidelines here. So these are the ones that have just been published online today, and the link is there. And these are the World Federation of Societies of Anesthesia Global Consensus Statement on the Principles of Environmentally Sustainable Anesthesia. And we'll come on to those in a second. But I just want to mention another paper as well, because this is mainly about anesthesia and perioperative care. But Jody's also produced some really good and really informative stuff in the BMJ last week about healthcare more generally, how healthcare professionals should and can act to reduce their global environmental impact. So the WFSA Global Consensus Statement, well, this basically came out of a third paper that was in the BJA last year, written by Forbes, McGain, and Jody, about environmental sustainability, and that's well worth a read as well if you get a chance. And what we were trying to do with the Global Consensus Statement was we had this aim of, what sustainability principles should any anesthesia service and any anaesthetist in worldwide aim to follow. And what we did was we identified 45 anesthesia providers with a specialist interest in sustainability. And we use this thing called a three-stage modified Delphi process, which is a way of coming to consensus in a sort of scientific way. And the 45 anesthetists submitted 633 principles, which we narrowed down to 58 statements, 38 of which were sort of fully agreed. More than 75% of us agreed that these should inform the consensus statements. We developed 3 core principles from these. One, that any environmental change that you make should be a safe one. Secondly, that countries should help each other, and that systems should be mandated to implement these changes. But then there were 7 fundamental principles, only one of which I'll talk about today, but these were basically minimizing, we should aim to minimize our environmental impact. There's some stuff around medications and equipment, which I'll talk about, quite a bit about waste, and then some stuff about education, research, leadership, and collaboration with industry. So principle 2 is the one that applies to TIVA and inhalational anesthetics, and principle 2 states that we should anaesthetists should use environmentally preferable medications and equipment when it's clinically safe to do so. And then there's a list of the actual principles that we agreed underneath there, and you can read those sort of. We'll sort of quickly go through them now. Sorry that they're a bit dense, but it's essentially what you've heard me talk about already. That we should be minimising the amount of stuff that we use. We should be using the least dangerous drugs. We should be using low flows if we're going to use inhalational agents and scavenging, and we should probably lock away the desflurane and nitrous oxide. What we agreed on but didn't reach the 75% consensus target on was that we agreed on that when feasible, anaesthetists should prioritise giving regional anaesthesia before total intravenous anaesthesia and before inhalational anaesthesia for environmental reasons. Now, you might think, well, 60, not achieving consensus, that's a little bit disappointing, but actually there is still quite some not apathy. There's still some concern out there that that we should be suggesting one type of anaesthetic ahead of others. And I think that makes people, certainly in the lower middle income countries and middle income countries, a little bit worried. And there's always this concern that it's, the high income countries are telling the rest of the world that they shouldn't be using some of these drugs and techniques that have benefited the high income countries already and now are being denied the sort of middle income countries. Only 68%. Well, I think that's actually quite good. There is quite good evidence that actually preferring regional anaesthesia to total intravenous anaesthesia to inhalational anaesthesia is the way forward. Certainly, there's been some debate in regional analgesia and pain medicine recently about this concept of the regional anaesthetic, which is basically that regional anaesthesia, because it uses less stuff, less equipment, less drugs, less paraphernalia, is probably a greener anaesthetic than any type of general anaesthetic. Having said that, Forsman, bless him, has just produced a paper in anesthesiology which suggests, at least in total knee replacements, that there's probably not much difference between regional anaesthesia and general anaesthesia for certain orthopedic procedures. But the sort of weight of the evidence as is at the moment, it suggests that regional anaesthesia is probably slightly greener than the general anaesthesia. If you do have to use general anaesthesia, then the evidence again tends to indicate that TIVA is probably greener than inhalational anaesthetics. Comes back to Jodie Sherman's paper in 2012 comparing inhalationals and propofol and the environmental impacts of those. And we'll come on to those in a second, but I'll show you a graph in a second. But there is a significant difference between the environmental impact of propofol use compared to inhalational use. And Tom's probably going to talk about this paper here in resources. But again, unless you're using sevoflurane at very low flows and using volatile capture technology and scavenging, then again, propofol seems to be a lot greener of a choice than inhalational anaesthesia. And then, of course, there are clinical benefits and occupational exposure benefits, malignant hypopyrexia, and probably neurocognitive benefits to using TIVA as compared to inhalational anaesthesia too. So, sort of in summary of this bit here, although the WFSA guidelines don't, we haven't quite reached consensus in this iteration that regional anaesthesia should be prioritized above total intravenous, above inhalational anaesthesia. What I would suggest that if you can, then you try and use regional anesthesia ahead of general anesthesia. So as I said, most of my practice is orthopedics. Unfortunately, it's lower limb. So basically my day consists of just giving spinal anesthetics, and I very rarely give a general anesthetic, and therefore my practice has got greener as a result of that, I think. If you have to use a general anesthetic, then at the moment, until the volatile capture technology and the scavenging and the use of low flow anesthesia has really sort of come into its own, then probably TIVA is better than inhalational anesthesia. And here's that key graph from Jodie's paper. It depends on exactly what's measured, but as you can see there, desflurane, isoflurane and sevoflurane. This is, a 1 Mach/hour equivalent, that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions involved in their manufacturing, their packaging, their transport, their drug delivery, and their is significantly more than that for propofol. You'll notice the B there. This is a graph that shows not taking into account the amount that leaks into the atmosphere with their use, but just the stuff involving the manufacturing and etc. But the graphs are roughly equivalent if albeit there's a lot more greenhouse gas emission equivalents if you take into account the amount of DES, ISO and sevoflurane that leaks into the atmosphere. That said, TIVA's not perfect itself. There are, I think that the main problem with TIVA is that the paraphernalia that you have to deal with, all the stuff that's involved in TIVA, is very visible. What you don't see the inhalational anesthetics that are leaking into the atmosphere, because you just don't see them because they're colourless gases. But you do see all the stuff that's involved in TIVA, and that gives the perception that TIVA is quite a wasteful and environmentally damaging thing to do. And actually what is really needed is a lot more research into the life cycle analysis of TIVA in general. We need to be looking into, well, should we be routinely using 2% propofol instead of 1% in our machines? So that's less glass, less plastic, less packaging per unit of propofol delivered to a patient. Should we even be using very large containers that we just withdraw what we need from as and when we use it? Should we be using propofol dispensers, for example? There's a lot of research that can be done around reducing the amount of paraphernalia and the amount of visible waste that that we can see with TIVA. And we've got to get on top of this idea. We've got to get on top of this thing with TIVA as well, of the actual wastage. It's estimated that about 40% of the TIVA that we draw up is actually wasted. It's that classic problem of the surgeon telling you that they've just finished their case just as you've plugged in the new 50 ml syringe. That's something we've got to assess. We've also got to assess or do a lot more research into another common concern that people have, and that's that the drug itself and the metabolites of the drug, if they go through the body, all get passed into the water table or into water cycles. And so we've got to do a lot more research into, for example, propofol metabolite capture in hospital toilets. So, when people have had the TIVA anaesthetic, should they be urinating into specific toilets that have capture technology that are able to remove the drugs and metabolites, or specifically the metabolites from water. But reassuringly, the effects of the drugs and metabolites that actually reach the water table are relatively low. So PBT effects are persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity. They're a way of measuring how damaging drugs and chemicals are to the waterborne environment itself. So reassuringly, propofol REMI and local anaesthetics, although they're persistent, they don't tend to bioaccumulate in animals at all, and they're relatively non-toxic. You'll notice that local anaesthetic agents are considerably less toxic than propofol. We've got to look into electricity usage. It's relatively high, so the amount of electricity that is used in a TIVA anesthetic, electricity makes up quite a large amount of the environmental impact of a TIVA anesthetic, but it's actually a very small amount of electricity in the grand scheme of things. So the same with plastics as well. Although it seems like a lot of plastic that we're using compared to the general amount of plastic that's used in an operation, it's relatively low. And we've got to get over this. We've got to get to grips with this whole idea of education. Probably the main barrier to not using TIVA is the fact that people just don't know how to use it. We're not taught TIVA as the primary thing when we're at, when we're training as anaesthetists. We're taught the big syringe, little syringe, inhalational anaesthetic. So we've got to, and 64% of the consensus group agree that actually we need to start prioritising regional anaesthesia and TIVA as above inhalational anaesthesia for teaching. So do I agree that TIVA is best? Well, it's better than inhalational anaesthetics overall, I think, but I think regional is better. And it's really regional anaesthesia is the way forward. It's the greenest of the anaesthetics. Just remember, you can control climate change, so buy less, fly less, less meat, less heat. That's all the stuff you do at home. Commit, that's important, and use regional or TIVA. And you can contact me there if you need to. Lovely, thanks for listening, and send your questions in, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you think.